Hello and welcome. I'm Athar Khan bringing you this week's Policy Watch. But first, a look at the top stories that are making the headlines this week. Pranab Mukherjee all set to become the 13th president of the country. Formal results of presidential poll to be announced on the 22nd. The new president to be sworn in on the 25th. The government approves the Steel Authority of India stake sale. After weeks of delay, government to offload 10.85% stake in the company. June inflation numbers released. Headline inflation eases slightly, but the consumer price index still in double digits. And sugar all set to become more expensive. Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs hikes the price of sugarcane by 17%. The government revises the food grain estimates for 2011-12. Numbers indicate the highest ever crop yield. Those were the headlines, and to discuss the top stories, I welcome back on the show Mr. Priya Ranjan, a managing editor of the Financial Chronicle and also a friend of the show. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. We'll jump right into our first story, which is the June inflation, of course. Now, aiding softening of manufactured products prices, headline inflation slowed to its lowest level in 5 months at 7.2% in June. However, food inflation still continues to be a worrisome factor, especially in the wake of a truant monsoon. Here's a report. Take a look.
The country might get some respite from skyrocketing prices as the number for June released by the government indicate. The month of June saw the lowest level of headline inflation in 5 months. The figure for June stands at 7.25%, marginally lower than the 7.55% recorded in May. But the middle class continues to bear the brunt of rising prices as overall food inflation inched up and still remains a matter of concern. According to the data released by the government, inflation for manufactured products eased to 5% from 5.2% in May. Non-food articles eased to 6.85% from 8.47% in May, while the food articles rose to 10.81% from 10.74% in May. The fall in June inflation numbers is largely attributed to decreasing prices of manufactured goods. Softening of the inflation numbers has further encouraged industry, and the chorus for rate cut by RBI is sure to grow louder in the days to come. With food inflation still in double digits and the monsoon playing truant, smart money is on the RBI keeping policy rates steady when it meets on the 31st of July. With Athar Khan, Rahul Kapoor for Rajya Sabha TV.
There you go. This is a slight drop, some would say even marginal in headline inflation. Do you think this is a true indicator of the inflation situation in the country?
We are clearly not over the hump yet. There are two factors basically of great concern at this point of time. One is the monsoon factor. As of today, we have a monsoon deficit of over 20%. Now, that's clearly going to, if the monsoon is bad, that's going to further aggravate the food inflation situation that we may
It will stoke inflation further. Yes.
That is despite having a good bumper harvest last year. But number two, even with regard to the so-called core inflation or even the manufacturing inflation, which is shown a slightly downward trend, there is the concern would be about the oil prices. Now, clearly, to the extent that diesel prices are not passed through yet, the inflation is artificially low. In case, should diesel prices be raised,
like the government is planning that,
which is very important and which appears inescapable if you have to keep this year's fiscal deficit at check. If diesel prices are to be increased, then this is going to create problem for the core inflation. It may be a one-time impact, over a period of time it will peter out, but there will be an inflationary impact.
So you're saying one shouldn't really get carried away because headline inflation is slightly down because food inflation is still in double digits, and this perhaps the slight dip in headline inflation could perhaps be a correction of a previous areas rather than seeing this as inflation really coming down.
You're absolutely right.
Right. So
food inflation continues to be a double digit, which is totally unacceptable. And the consumer price index, which is food plus certain other consumer products, that also continues to be over 10%. Now, so I would say that inflationary expectations are far from being anchored.
Right. For the benefit of our viewers, give us a sense on why we are seeing different numbers for headline inflation and consumer CPI food inflation is still going up. 7.25 is what the headline inflation for June is, but the CPI or food inflation is still high. Why the difference in these two numbers? For the benefit of our viewers, why are we seeing this trend?
No, that is because the headline inflation is measured by the wholesale price index.
WPI.
Yes, which is WPI. Now, but as consumers, we do not consume or buy things in wholesale. We buy things in retail, number one. Number two, in the wholesale price index, prices of commodities which are captured are also intermediate products and raw materials, which are not directly consumed, are not part of the consumer price index. The consumer price index has a different basket of commodities, prices of which are monitored by consumer price index, which are more relevant to the consumer. Wholesale price index, on the other hand, is more of a manufactured price index. So the difference between the two continues to the extent that manufacturing products are showing a declining trend. That is getting reflected in the wholesale price index, but that is not happening with regard to the food prices. It's not happening with regard to several other consumer products. So the consumer price index remains over 10%.
There you go. So a very simple explanation. I hope the viewers who really don't understand why the divergence in headline inflation and consumer price index or the food inflation, Mr. Dasher's explanation was necessary. Of course, now the point arises now. How significant is this dip in June in headline inflation, especially given the fact that RBI is meeting on July 31st now, at a time when industry has weakened, growth has weakened, there's a demand for a rate cut. But it is expected by most analysts that given there is little support from the government side, RBI is expected to hold steady on its policy rates. What is your take on it? How significant will June headline inflation coming slightly down, will that affect the RBI's decision at all?
It's actually very difficult to double guess RBI. RBI is in a very difficult situation.
Very tight spot.
It's in a very tight spot. And the decline that we have seen in June, even in the headline inflation, that is only very marginal. It's 7.25 from 7.55 in May. Yeah. So that's not much. And as earlier I was mentioning, it's still, even the core inflation runs the risk of moving up, particularly because of the fuel prices and the pass-through effect that it may have. So RBI would continue to be, I would tend to believe they would continue to be exercising caution, and keep inflation as their primary target. There are concerns about growth, but I do not think that the RBI's primary concern is going to be growth at this point of time.
And it's difficult for them to take a decision because Governor Subbarao has already said that our policy is inflation-centric. Until inflation comes down, we'll have a tough time actually cutting rates. Of course, pertinent point. So let's talk about the monsoon for a bit now. Very briefly, if you could. Monsoon started out as deficient when it started out. You said 20% shortfall there in the monsoon. But KV Thomas has come out and said, and even Sharad Pawar has said that monsoon is picking up. It has gotten better over time. How important is the remainder of the monsoon, whatever little is left, and how important is it going to be on the inflation situation overall in the country?
Well, see the rainfall as such, the aggregate numbers, that is more important than that is the agroclimatic zones and the spread both in terms of the space and the interval of precipitation over the country, the individual agroclimatic zones that we have. So to that extent, it is the distribution of monsoon which is more important, or distribution of rains which is more important.
Right.
Now we've had a certain pattern up to now that has been on the deficient side, and to a large extent that has impacted the sowing operations of various crops.
Right.
I would, there could be, it could be made up. In paddy, for instance, it's possible perhaps to do that, but already certain crops have suffered from this early deficiency in monsoon.
Right.
Like the coarse grain, for instance, or even oilseed and pulses.
Right,
I think even if monsoon makes up to an extent in the remaining period of the season, pulses and oilseeds are going to be affected.
So you're saying distribution is obviously more important. Distribution of the monsoon is more important. Isn't
That's
it?
right.
Absolutely. On that note, sir, we'll take a break right now. Don't go anywhere. More to come with Priya Ranjan Dash after the break. Take a break. Come back. Welcome back to Policy Watch. Now, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs, CCEA, has increased the fair and remunerative price, or FRP, for sugarcane by 17.25% to compensate farmers for rising cultivation costs. FRP is the price that mills pay to farmers for sugarcane. Sugar mills will now have to pay farmers at least 170 rupees per quintal as the fair and remunerative price, FRP, for sugarcane in the new season, up from 145 per quintal in the current season. All eyes now will be on the state-advised price for cane that will be announced later by Uttar Pradesh, Punjab and Tamil Nadu using FRP as its base. Now, sir, this, of course, positive step for sugarcane farmers. It's been raised from 145 per quintal to 170 for quintal. That's a decent enough jump. And do you think it'll benefit farmers like it's supposed to, or do you think the middlemen somehow will come in and get their profit as well?
No, I don't think it's a question of middlemen. It's a policy of raising every year. That continues to happen. Of course, the costs of farming in general is going up, and the farmers need to be compensated. But in sugar particularly, we've had this cycle of one bust year and one boom year.
Right.
So,
And we're currently in the boom year right now.
Currently in the boom year. And you would expect a bust year. So to the extent that the sugarcane prices have been increased, you would expect the farmer to have the incentive. Just a little while ago, we were talking about food price inflation. Now, this entire farm pricing mechanism of administrative control is creating a lot of distortion. And it has now, I think, led to structural rigidity in the system, which is what is a major reason for why food prices or food inflation now tend to be so high and appear to be getting out of control.
So I want to talk about a little bit about state-advised prices or SAPs as well. There is some unevenness in the sugar pricing in the country. Like Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh, they have the SAP or state advisory price. Uttar Pradesh, Tamil Nadu and Punjab have that. Now, the SAP for UP is 250 per quintal, which is higher than even the revised figure in 170 right now. So does that mean the revised FRP won't apply in states like UP and Tamil Nadu?
No, it is not like it is the central price the states come up with their own, which is a plus over the price that is announced centrally. Now, as we know, sugarcane prices are not purely economic considerations. These are political considerations which have often governed it. So to that extent, the state governments too often pandered to the so-called sugarcane lobby. And sometimes the state advisory prices are completely out of tune with the economic reality. And we've paid prices for such policies in the past, but we appear to be, yes.
And do you, of course, do you think that perhaps hiking sugarcane rate this time around also has political connotations as well?
Well, it is always political. The cane pricing is always political. Sometimes politics is the dominant factor. You see, basically one has to see that one has to look at the viability of the sugar industry too. And what happens is sometimes when cane prices are fixed at an artificially high level to meet certain political objective of either a state assembly election coming up or other political factors like that, it has been seen that invariably it leads to huge cane areas in payments to the farmers, which ultimately goes against the farmers' interest.
Right. Very quickly, sir, a yes or no answer. Do you think it was the right move, or do you have problems with it? Very quickly.
No, I think this kind of an increase at the central level is quite but I have a problem with the long-term
effects of it.
Yes.
But right now the decision, of course, will benefit sugarcane
farmers. As a continuation of the policy.
Right.
This kind of an annual hike is quite in order.
Right. We'll take another short break, sir, right now. We'll come back with our third story of the week. Don't go anywhere. Special interview lined up with a special person in the third segment. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Policy Watch. The government has revised food grains estimate for the year 2011-12, and the government is confident that the yield will be the highest ever. The estimates were revised from 247 million tons to over 252 million tons for the 2011-12 period. Policy Watch went out of the studio to get an expert's view on the revision and the food grain situation in the country. Professor Himanshu is an authority on poverty and agricultural data. He teaches in Jawaharlal Nehru University in the Center for Social Sciences and was also heavily involved with the path-breaking Suresh Tendulkar report commissioned by the government. Here are some excerpts of that interview. Take a look.
There is a first advance estimate, second advance estimate, and then finally the fourth advance estimate. The fourth estimate is the final one, and this is finally based on the crop cutting experiments, and that is why there is a revision, which is the final number. This kind of a revision is normal, but this year's revision, particularly for the Rabi crops, the winter crop, has been more than what we normally get in the other years, and that probably has to do with the performance of the Rabi crop, 81 million tons in our food stocks. That is something which is now being seen as some kind of a godsend bounty to the government of India. But you must realize that this is something which is happening even in a period when we had increasing production. So there's so much amount of food grains being kept in the food stocks, that itself is not the right policy to do. So suddenly we have some kind of a problem as far as the rains are concerned. So you are looking at it as some kind of a relief. But the fact also remains that last year, if there were something like 190 or 200 million tons of production, as far as the rice and wheat products are concerned, cereals are concerned, 80 million tons were basically put down in stocks. That basically reduces supply in the market. So today what is being seen is as some kind of a fortunate event, is actually the background of that has led to some kind of incidence of reduced supply in the market, and that is why we see some kind of food inflation also creeping in. Even in the headline inflation, the food inflation has not gone down. Food inflation is still in double digit, and it has marginally gone up. So in a sense, food inflation hasn't gone down. Overinflation has gone down because of fuel and other issues in that sense. So I would still say that the fear of food inflation is still there, very much there, is still there in double digit. And today the data has come out from the retail price inflation, the consumer price inflation. That again is still continuing to be in double digit, which is basically tracking as to what the consumers are paying out of it. So I think inflation is simply cannot be wished away. And going by the fact that we are going through a midst of a severe fiscal crisis, monsoons are not going to be very good, and there is a serious possibility of a drought, I think the food inflation has to be tackled in a much more serious way than the government has offered so far.
Professor Himanshu of Jawaharlal Nehru University there talking to me just before we started recording this particular show. So Professor Himanshu had a very interesting point to tell me. When I asked him whether this revision is normal or not, he said yes, these revisions are quite normal and one shouldn't read too much into it. But he also said a very important point that more than the revisions itself, what is despicable in the country and the larger issue is the distribution of those stocks. Even if KV Thomas says that we have enough stocks, the distribution is the problem. Do you agree with that?
Yes, that distribution is a problem. But as I was talking earlier, you see, we've had food grain production at record levels. Even last year, we had a very good crop. And now we have even a better crop. So, but unfortunately, we've had high food inflation. Now, record production, agricultural production, coinciding with high food inflation, that's a phenomenon that we have to see.
It's sort of a no-win situation for us then,
it is clearly, like Professor Himanshu mentioned, it is a question of maldistribution, number one. Number two, also to the earlier point that I was mentioning, this successive increase in the minimum support price for the crops that we have had. Now, every year, if you give the increase the minimum support price by 20%, you are willy-nilly ensuring that at the consumer end, the price is up by 20%. So whether you have a record crop or you don't, your prices tend to be high.
Right.
That is number one.
Right.
So what these higher prices do is obviously they incentivize higher production and higher procurement of grain, which are procured and stored and distributed in the most inefficient manner. So a lot of wastage and losses and a lot of overheads, a lot of subsidies. Now that has created, distorted the entire food economy.
Right.
I would say.
Right.
So distribution is a major issue. Now market is a mechanism of ensuring an appropriate distribution of anything for that matter.
Any product for that matter.
For that matter. Now, in our country, we've had a public distribution system, which is very essential and required for a country like us, because we have 1 billion plus or 1.21 billion people to feed, and we have poverty and issues of food security, which cannot be left to market forces alone.
Absolutely.
But we've not tried to make the public distribution system efficient or market-oriented, as I would
Absolutely. And
say.
that itself is essentially the problem. On that note, sir, we'll have to end the show today. Thank you so much for joining us on Policy Watch again. That was Priya Ranjan, Managing Editor of the Financial Chronicle. Our first story on Policy Watch this week was, of course, June inflation numbers. A slight dip in headline inflation, of course, although more worrying is the fact that food inflation is still in double digits. One shouldn't get really carried away by this dip, of course. This doesn't really mean that inflation is coming down. We need to see where food inflation is going as well. And like Priya Ranjan said, this is also perhaps because oil prices have eased up. And one thing to watch out for, of course, is whether or not the government deregulates diesel like it's been promising. Our second story this week on Policy Watch was the hike in sugarcane prices, the fair and remunerative price that mills pay sugarcane farmers. Of course, in the scheme of things, my guest seems to think it's the right decision. But yes, of course, he does have problems with the long-term effects of such a policy, and that has to be taken into consideration while looking at the agriculture sector as a whole. Our third story, for which we got Professor Himanshu as well, was the government revising food grain estimates. There might be enough food grains, like the Food Minister K.V. Thomas has told us time and again. But of course, the key question is, again, the public distribution system in India, the PDS, is still, some consider, very flawed and inefficient, and for us to be better at distributing those stocks that we have, what's the point if they're rot in godowns? Of course, PDS has to be strengthened, has to be redefined, so that food in godowns, grains in godowns actually go to the people who actually need them. That's all the time we have on Policy Watch this week. Till next time, Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching.